All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Ask the Agronomist this morning. Appreciate those of you joining in. If you haven't been here before and unfamiliar with the process, you want to chat in a live question. Producer Adam is here with us this morning. Nice to be back with Adam again this week. He's been absent for a while, and we got by without him 1 week because he was gone, and then the next week we sent him to the wrong location, so we got by without him kind of intentionally last episode. But he's back with us here today. We're back in the Yetter Studios here in Macomb, Illinois. So thanks to Yetter for allowing us to use our facility. They aren't using their dry erase board near enough because it still had my information on it from the last time that I did Ask the Agronomist. So nice to be back with you. And for just a reminder, if you want to chat in your live questions, which we love the live chat questions, we always move those up to the top of the list. Be sure to sign in with your YouTube account or with any Gmail account. I've got kind of a long list of things that I want to touch on today. And Adam's got some information, but we're always really encourage live questions coming in. So I guess we'll kick off with a little bit of a harvest update. I will be celebrating one of these times on Ask the Agronomist that I've actually completed my harvest, but I haven't yet. So it's been a tough November for soybeans, as most of you who still have soybeans left to harvest realize. Hasn't been great conditions for doing down corn either. So if you've got standing corn, you've been able to get quite a bit of work done the last couple of weeks. If you've got down corn or soybeans, it's been kind of tough to find many hours of many days to be in the field. So hopefully, if you're not wrapped up with harvest, hopefully you can be soon. We have had reasonably good weather for getting fall work done as far as tillage and fertilizer applications. Was a lot of nervousness a couple weeks ago when we were really wet that we're going to have opportunities to get fall fertilizer work done. And if you've been in contact with your fertilizer suppliers, you know the price difference between doing it now and perhaps doing it next spring is a little scary. So we were hopeful that we would be able to get a lot of work done this fall, and that actually kind of relates to a couple fertility conversations I wanted to have here today. So I guess with that, we'll go ahead and jump into those until we get some live questions rolling in. I've had a lot of questions the last few weeks from guys that historically have either been, partial UAN users or have used some UAN in the spring or UAN side dress. And, when you're putting together your nitrogen budget, it's fairly customary in central Illinois that fall anhydrous is kind of the biggest part of your nitrogen budget. But then you supplement that either with some spring broadcast UAN as a weed and feed type carrier, side dress UAN, UAN and starter. So it's fairly common that we have a combination of anhydrous and UAN. And if you're in that category, a lot of folks in that category, let's say they normally put on 140 units of anhydrous in the fall, hopefully with an inhibitor. And then they'll run 45 to 60 units of UAN in the spring. And if you've talked to your fertilizer suppliers, the prospects for UAN pricing in the spring are a little scary. And so we've gotten lots of questions about, well, what if I just put on more anhydrous in the fall? That's my cheapest source of nitrogen. I get it on there. And then I either cut back on that spring UAN application or don't make the spring UAN application at all. So I guess a couple things from a total end budget standpoint, it really doesn't matter. So you can do 140 plus 60 to equal 200, or you can do 175 plus 25 to equal 200, or you can do 200 plus 0 to equal 200. You can still get, if 200 is what you want, I'm not saying that's what you need, but if that's what you want, you can get to 200, multiple different ways. The challenge that or concern I have is there's probably more value in having that readily available spring nitrogen than just the pounds that it's supplying. So yes, it's part of your total nitrogen budget, but if you don't have any readily available nitrogen out there in the spring, and that fall anhydrous is not particularly readily available in the spring to the plant. It might be in a plant usable form, but it may not be in a plant usable location. And I do think that we get a lot of benefit in some cases, especially corn on corn. On rotated ground, you probably got a little more flexibility. But probably the ugliest cornfields I look at every spring would be spring anhydrous with no UAN, corn on corn. The second ugliest fields I look at would be fall anhydrous with no UAN, spring UAN, corn on corn. And then your rotated ground is typically, more forgiving. We don't get as much nitrogen tie-up. There's more nitrogen available in the soil to those seedling plants in the spring. But just be aware that if you pull that spring UAN application out of your program, it's going to be a while before those corn roots are developed enough and deep enough that they're really into that anhydrous. And that time period between when those plants quit living off the seed and get into your fall nitrogen, that plant might be a little starved for nitrogen. And we've learned through some of the high yield work that people have done, if that corn plant in that seedling stage is sensing it's in a nitrogen limiting environment, it can get conservative. And that's too early in the season for your corn plant to be getting conservative. It is going to be a challenge this next year because economics do factor in what is the optimum rate of nitrogen. So there's a lot of calculations out there that are available. A lot of universities have done a lot of good work trying to figure out what is the right rate of nitrogen. Well, the right rate of nitrogen, is going to be influenced by the commodity price for the corn and the input cost for the fertilizer. And today, both of those are high. So they are, to some extent, canceling each other out. Now, last year, you kind of had the luxury of having a high commodity price with last year's low fertilizer prices. And so that worked out really nice. Now we're kind of, instead of high and low, we're high and high. Worst case scenario, as we start to see, commodity prices decline at some point, how long is it going to take for that fertilizer price to get back down? So as you're trying to make those decisions, just recognize that, economics do influence, agronomy. And next year may be one of those years where, producing the maximum yield, is that going to be the most profitable? Generally it is. And as we try to save money on inputs, if you save money that reduces yield, typically you didn't really save any money. If you can save money that doesn't reduce your yield, then that's money in your pocket. If your attempt to save money is reducing your yield, that's probably money leaving your pocket rather than adding savings to the pocket. So Adam, anything you want to add or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, some pretty interesting dynamics going on, and some guys are making some tough decisions and really trying to get down to some addressing of how many pounds per bushel do I really need to focus on.
Right.
Of course, we all know that changes year to year as to what the optimal
soil to soil field.
Yeah, there's a lot of variables that influence that, but there's a couple different things that come up in conversations I've had. Is one, you've got it written down here as well. Is there anything else that we could supplement, particularly something like sulfur,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe give us a little bit more nitrogen a little bit? And then just the other comment I would make, I guess, is that no matter what price you market your grain at, if you have more bushels, you make more money. If you have less bushels, you make less money, no matter whether you're marketing stuff at a good price or a bad price. More bushels means more money.
Yeah.
So,
well, and you were talking about that nitrogen rate response, and what we're trying to decide really in year in, year out is where do you want to be on that response curve? And as that curve gets flat up here, it takes more pounds of nitrogen for each additional bushel of corn. And, there's going to be some nitrogen prices out there that are, a lot higher than what we're used to. And at some point you get up here in this point of diminishing returns. And if an extra pound of nitrogen is not giving you enough bushels to pay for the pound of nitrogen, then economics would say that's where you stop. Now, if you're looking for environmental reasons and other factors and things to consider, you might stop a little bit ahead of the economic response. But, that economic response curve is what's going to drive that. And as the price of nitrogen goes up and the price of the commodity goes down, you're going to back further down this curve. As the price of N goes down and commodity prices go up, then you can push it higher on this curve. And it is pretty flat up here. So honestly, this surprises growers a lot of times. And if you've never done nitrogen rate research, this might be difficult to believe. But in a lot of cases, let's say right here is, let's say this is 140 applied. And let's say up here, this is, 200 applied. In some cases, the yield difference between 140 applied and 200 applied is surprisingly small. And that's because that curve gets really flat up here at the top. The work that Dr. Beetle has done at U of I has consistently shown that your biggest bang for your nitrogen buck is the first 60 pounds you apply. And then after that, it just gets less and less and less and less of a yield response. So, there are situations where you can cut back and not really see much of a yield difference. There are other situations, maybe based on the soil type, based on the weather, based on the year, based on the hybrid, based on lots of variables. A little bit of cutback might trim your yield, by more than what you saved in nitrogen. So it's really hard to make more money in production agriculture by saving. To Adam's point, typically the way we make more money is by producing more. And that's that's easy for a supplier to say, and sometimes harder for a producer to accept that. But if you do the math on that, it is really hard to save enough money to make more money if in the process of saving money you reduced your yield, because it is such a yield-driven equation.
And honestly, I think some of my advice would be is that when you're thinking about that curve and the shape of that curve, there's a lot of things that influence that. Soil type, as you mentioned, Lance, the environment has a big part of it as well, right? And I think going forward in 2022 with some of the prices that we're seeing with the nitrogen commodities is that you need to look at each field and try to make a decision based on field-to-field dynamics that you've observed over time as a grower. If you've got a field that typically you tend to notice more nitrogen deficiencies in, that's probably not the field where you want to skimp.
Right.
That's probably where you want to be a little bit more aggressive. So I think you need to take the time, try and break it down, and use some of your experience on your farm to try and tweak out the efficiencies that you can there.
Right. And you'd asked about sulfur. I'm a big sulfur supporter, promoter. We've talked a lot about sulfur. You can't necessarily replace nitrogen with sulfur, but I would argue in some ways you kind of can. So here's the way I would say that. Using more sulfur, I don't necessarily think is going to reduce the amount of nitrogen that crop's going to want. But there is a benefit to having plenty of sulfur there, and sulfur is a more cosmetic nutrient than nitrogen, in my opinion. And crop that has plenty of sulfur always looks better. Crops that have adequate amounts of sulfur tend to yield better. And so visually, you probably could mask, a little bit of nitrogen with a little additional sulfur. So if you feel, based on your pricing scenarios, that you're getting a better buy on sulfur than you are on nitrogen, maybe you try to get by with a little bit less nitrogen, but maybe we use a little bit more sulfur. That doesn't mean that sulfur replaces nitrogen, but it does mean in most cases we're probably not using enough sulfur to begin with. So if you feel that your ability to apply sulfur is more economically advantageous than your ability to apply nitrogen, I wouldn't suggest skimping on both, but maybe you can play a little bit with that sulfur and nitrogen ratio and maybe try using a little bit of additional sulfur. But in the end, economics are going to dictate, everything we do in agriculture, and it comes down to, how much we spend on inputs versus how much we produce in output. And that's probably enough time spent on that. You'll all make your own decisions there. While we're on the subject of fertility, we talked a little bit about this on our last episode, so I won't spend a lot of time here, but I do think, as to Adam's point, as you're trying to get more prescriptive with your nitrogen. I think we need to be more prescriptive with our P and K investment as well. And, let's rely on our soil tests. If you don't have new soil tests, it'd be a good year to get them. The cost of soil testing is so insignificant compared to the cost of fertilizer. We need to be doing more soil testing. I think other things you can do to make your fertility investment more efficient would be to go to annual applications rather than every other year putting on 2 years worth of fertilizer. That extra application cost is also relatively insignificant compared to the price of the fertilizer. Looking at, maybe making a withdrawal out of the bank account if you've got really good soil test levels, more than we would say are adequate. There's nothing wrong with reducing the amount that you put on, or if your soil tests are high enough, even skipping a year's application is not the end of the world. I've made a decision on my operation. I'm running 3/4 removal this year. So I am mining every acre of my farm a little bit because I'm only putting back on 75% of what I removed. I also don't think if you've been on a buildup program on a farm, I don't think here where we probably need to be doing a lot of buildup. Buildup is a very expensive proposition, even in a normal year, because you have to put on so much more than the crop needs to raise the soil test. So we can probably put that off for times when we've got a little more economical fertilizer prices and try to be, more prescriptive with that fertility that we are putting out there. So when we touch a little bit on some herbicide stuff, and then we'll maybe get into some rootworm conversations, and we'll talk about SmartStax Pro as well, which is a new rootworm technology that we're going to be introducing for next year. So from a herbicide standpoint, there's been a lot of conversations in the last few weeks about fertilizer pricing going up, projected shortages of certain products, and while we're a little bit used to times of high demand, pricing going up, we aren't really used to not being able to get product in season, and so that is kind of a new thing. And if you've been trying to buy parts, if you've been trying to buy equipment, if you've been trying to buy your favorite diet soda at Casey's some days, you find there's a lot of supply challenges throughout the whole supply chain, and getting product where it needs to be is a real challenge in basically all aspects of life these days. So there will be some actual shortages of product next year. There will be some price increases on a lot of products next year. And those things are frustrating growers as they're trying to make decisions on what they ought to do for next year. So I think there are some I would call them realities of weed control that we just need to expect, accept, understand. Number one being that the cost of weed control is increasing. Not just because the price of products is going up, also because weeds are becoming more difficult to control, and it's taking more products to do the job than it did 10 years ago when in most cases Roundup was all anybody was using. I think the complexity of weed control is increasing. So that's not only because of the systems that are out there today, in some cases being more complex. Weed resistance is making it more complex. The fact that you can't use just one product, you can't just keep spraying the same product, you can't just use more of the same product if the rate you used didn't work. We didn't really realize how good we had it for about 20 years in weed control, and we're still kind of getting readjusted to the new realities of it's not as hard to control weeds as it was in the mid 90s. But it's more like the mid 90s than it was 10 years ago as far as how difficult it is to get a clean field. I do think that shortages will be a reality in 22. How much that impacts what we do is a little bit of an unknown. I think in a lot of cases there'll probably be product, but is it in the right place on the day that you need it? Will it always be available the day you need it? I think we need to stay flexible. We need to design herbicide programs that give us the flexibility to not lock us into, I absolutely got to have this product on this day. Be flexible. And I think we'll talk about residuals here in a minute, but, getting yourself set up with a good, strong residual program is going to maximize your flexibility on the post-emergence side of things. So and I would also say there is no silver bullet system. There is no system that is cheap, readily available, easy to use, and effective. There are systems that are effective. There are systems that are cheaper. There are systems that are easier. There is no system that is all those things all combined into one. And so that's another reality that I think we need to face. I also think it's not, and I'm saying this as a bear guy, so some of you would say this is just me showing my bias, but I do think that there's a lot of evidence to support that dicamba-based programs are the best value, the most effective, and give you a lot of really good options, and we need to utilize that technology where we can. Granted, doesn't fit everywhere, doesn't fit every scenario. Sometimes maybe you can only use it pre, sometimes you can use it pre and post. There are situations where you're maybe not going to want to use it either pre or post, but it gives you the most bang for the buck from a yield and weed control standpoint. And so wherever you can utilize dicamba in a system, that's where I would start. And then I also think that good basic weed control principles apply to all systems. And I don't care whether you're a conventional guy, Extend Flex guy, an Enlist guy, it doesn't matter to me what system you're on. All of these principles apply to those systems. And I would say the first one is you start with a good residual foundation. There really is no system today that can give you sustainable, reliable, effective weed control total post. That's just asking for trouble. We see guys every year that didn't get a pre on, weather delays or some other issue prevents you from being timely with your post, or your post program didn't work that good, and we just can't rely 100% on post-emergence weed control for all of our weed control. I also think regardless of what system you're in, making those post-emergence applications earlier in the season to smaller weeds is critical. We also don't have of killing every big weed that's out there anymore. There was really one product ever that was good on killing big weeds, and that was glyphosate. And once resistance started to impact the efficacy of glyphosate, the ability to reliably control big weeds. Now, you can still get big weeds, when you're lucky, but you can't count on it. And, if you're not using dicamba voluntarily or otherwise, your ability to kill big weeds is even further reduced. So a lot of the acres out there that are getting sprayed, we need to be targeting small weeds, which means earlier post-emergence applications. A lot of people harp on cutoff dates and restrictions, and I would argue that regardless of what system you're using, 95% of our herbicide applications should be done before we get to anybody's cutoff date on anybody's label. Some would argue it's nice to have the flexibility to spray all summer long, but that's really not what we should be doing. We always need to utilize overlapping residuals to take the pressure off those post-emergence applications. So if you're not currently using residuals at all in your soybean system, I would encourage you to start. If you're only using residuals once, I would encourage you to use residuals twice. And if you're doing the overlapping residual effectively, you need to get the second residual application on before the first one quits working. That's the overlapping concept. If you put that first residual out there, say in early April, and your post residual is not going on until late June or early July, they didn't overlap. You just use residuals twice. They're not as effective in that situation as they are if you get the second application on before the first one quits working. So, we need to use adequate rates and multiple effective, and the term multiple and effective are equally important modes of action. So you can load up a program with a lot of modes of action and a lot of different products, but if those products are not effective against a certain weed species, you might have 4 different products on the acre, and maybe you've got 3 different modes of action with those 4 products. But if only one of those modes of action is effective on water hemp, you've only got 1 mode of action on water hemp. So try to design those programs to have more than 1 effective mode of action on each different weed species that you're worried about controlling. And then I've got a list of 4 things I would say you should never do, regardless of what system you're using. We should never apply any herbicide on soybeans after R2. That's primarily for 2 reasons. One, if you're off label. And secondly, you're running the risk of reducing your yield from a herbicide stress standpoint. Related to number 1 would be number 2. We should never throw a herbicide in with a fungicide, because if you are, you're either spraying the fungicide too early or you're spraying the herbicide too late, or in some cases both. We should never over rely on post-emergence weed control and not utilize a pre. And I would say we should never wait until the weeds are bigger to spray. Year in and year out, there are far more failures. There's been a lot of talk the last couple of years. This is kind of driven by cutoff date and people spraying uncomfortably early. There's been a whole lot of talk about, my weed control wasn't good because I sprayed too early. I had to spray too early. Year in and year out, I look at way more fields that are problems because they got sprayed too late than because they got sprayed too early. So we do have to adjust our management in some cases to these earlier applications. And it was easier to get a clean field at harvest spraying late. It's not easier to get high yielding soybeans spraying late. So it's kind of a matter of what you want. We want high yielding soybeans, we want clean fields. In some cases, clean field wasn't giving you your highest yield if the way you were getting a clean field was letting everything come up, letting everything get big, letting everything get huge, and then spraying it late with Roundup or whatever product you were using at the time. So it is more difficult in some cases to manage season-long weed control than it used to be, because it's not as easy to do those Hail Mary late applications as it used to be. I would argue the Hail Mary late applications were never a good thing, but they used to be effective. And so we kind of got used to doing that in some cases. And we're planting soybeans a month earlier than we used to in a lot of cases. And so that's adding a whole month to the amount of, weed-free field that we're trying to create. And that puts a lot more pressure on all of our products. If you want to wait till June 1st to plant soybeans, it's easier to get good weed control in June 1st planted soybeans than it is April 1st planted soybeans. But for lots of reasons, primarily better yield, we're going to continue to drive towards those earlier planted fields. So those are just some things I think that, you should think about and work through as you're trying to make decisions for next year's herbicide program. A little bit related to that, I'll put in another plug for one of my favorite weed control practices, and that's the good old fall burn down. We've got, lots of time left in the growing season that we can still do fall burn downs. I know there's nights in the forecast in the teens and low 20s. That's okay. We can let those nights come and go and still do fall burn down after that. I know everybody out there working in retail that's trying to get dry on, trying to get anhydrous on. Some cases, the last thing you want, some wiseacre coming in asking about doing fall burn down, because that just logistically is a real challenge. But if you have the ability to get a fall burn down on, especially on long-term continuous no-till fields where you've got heavy winter annual weed pressure, just remember when you were in that field this spring, how badly you wished you'd done a fall burn down the year before. This happens every year. Every year we skip the fall burn down. Spring comes, we're like, crap, I should have got that fall burn down done. I'm going to do it this fall. And then we get the field cleaned up. We get through summer and we get through harvest. We get busy. It's been 8 months since we were looking at that nasty green field in the spring. Kind of out of sight, out of mind. We talk ourselves out of doing the fall burn down, and we repeat the process all over again and make the same mistake. So if you've ever been frustrated in the spring and wished you would have done a fall burn down, now's the year to do one. I would argue that next spring could be worse than this spring was for green fields, because we harvested a lot of these fields really early this fall. And the earlier you get that crop out, the more opportunity you're giving those winter annual weeds to get established and get off to a head start. And if you've ever battled mare's tail in crop, if you're trying to kill mare's tail in crop without dicamba, I wish you well. You're probably not going to be successful with that. So if you're trying to not use dicamba in a system, fall burn down is even more critical for you, because that's your only chance to kill mare's tail. So if you're fighting mare's tail, if you're fighting winter annuals, if you want to give yourself the flexibility in the spring to maybe plant first and then spray after you plant, really, really, really encourage you to look at a fall burn down program. So just some good things to think of from a herbicide standpoint. Question, Adam?
So we had a couple different questions come in.
Cool.
One of them somewhat related to what we're talking about as far as weed control. Another one actually that came in first, we'll make sure we get to it, was from Dirt Doctorful. So first one, he's
always, I don't know who that is, but he's always good for questions.
He is. We appreciate him big time. And so we'll make sure as we transition to the SmartStax stuff, his question is about hybrids in particular. But Noah Forlenis has a question that's about weed control. And he says, what program would you recommend for field and waterway edges that have extreme waterhemp pressure? Looking for something to spray with a small boom on side by side around the field edges and waterways.
Yeah. So, I mean, really what you've got going on there, you've got a lot of sunlight, you've got heavier weed pressure, you've in some cases got less canopy. Those are our, toughest situations. If we're looking at things post-emergence that are effective on water hemp, but basically there are three. There's dicamba, Liberty, 2,4-D. So those are, if you're using a system that gives you the ability to spray, one or more of those products post-emergence, that's what's going to control water hemp. From a residual standpoint, you might consider, strengthening your residual program, or maybe trying to put on a higher rate of residual on those field edges. But having a high rate of residual, good water hemp residual or PPO herbicides, things like metribuzin, tend to be our best soil water hemp products. And then getting additional group 15 out there on that post trip. So if you haven't been doing a overlapping residual where you've got a good full rate pre up front, and then putting additional group 15 on in the form of a warrant or an outlook or residua post emergence, that might be something to look at. As I said earlier, we really don't want to be broadcasting whole fields with herbicides late. But if you do need to clean up some field edges late, recognizing that we need to follow product labels, and we're possibly going to, reduce our yield a little bit. But generally in that situation, you're out there for cosmetic reasons because you don't like the way that field edge looks. And if you're willing to sacrifice some yield to have a cleaner field edge, there are, things that you can do there. But, really from a post-emergent standpoint, I would say dicamba number one, Liberty or 2,4-D would be your second option. Dicamba would be the best on bigger water hemp. But like I said earlier, we don't want to count on anything to control big water hemp. So I would say, strong residual, overlapping residual, using a product post-emergence that is effective on water hemp. And then, if you've got a piece of equipment that allows you to, touch up that field edge without spraying the whole field, then you can, make another pass on that with one of those effective post-emergence products if you need to. But I would say don't let those water hemp get too big. And you'd be better off to spray twice, spraying small water hemp twice, than you would be to, wait until they get big and then try to take them out when they're knee high or bigger.
Thanks again for the question, Noah. So transition now to Dirt Doctorful's question, which is a fun question. I like it.
Okay.
He says, what corn hybrids are you excited about for 2022? Hopefully ones that don't need much fertilizer and don't get crown rot.
Well, at first I thought maybe that was like one of our salesmen in disguise, trying to advertise products. But when you finish the question, I realized, nope, that's a real question, real question there. So every year we look at new products. I'll be honest with you, 21 was a horrible year to evaluate new products because it was such a bizarre environment. And almost no product performed the way people expected it to in 21. We had good products that were not good, and we had mediocre products that were great, and everything in between. So 21 was a very bizarre environment to be looking at new products. So I saw 2 or 3 new products this year from DeKalb that I was excited about, but I want to see them in a more normal year. So I'm looking forward to retesting, all of this year's new products next year. And then here in about 2 weeks, I'll find out what all the brand new hybrids for 23 will be that will just be in plots in 22. So I think our plots are going to be huge next year because I basically want to retest everything that we tested in 21. And then we're going to add all the brand new products for 22. So to dig specifically into that crown rot curveball that he threw into that question, I'll be excited if we ever have a hybrid that's resistant to crown rot. There are differences, and I think in some cases, some of the hybrids that were surprisingly good in 21 were surprisingly good because they had the ability to tolerate crown rot. Seed treatments help. V5 fungicides help a lot. I'll do a little bit of a teaser, hopefully either in 2 weeks or in 4 weeks. I'm not sure which. Whenever Cal and I can get our schedules to jive, I'm going to have Chris on with me as a guest agronomist on Ask the Agronomist, and we'll go through his crown rot work that he's been doing the last 3 years. We're also working with the University of Nebraska, doing some studies on crown rot. I submitted a lot of samples into that study program this fall from different fields, trying to figure out, how many different pathogens are involved, how many different races are involved. That's what makes crown rot so difficult. There's, if you leave red root rot out, which I frankly wouldn't leave it out, it's not necessarily considered to be a crown rot pathogen, but it's causing all the same problems as crown rot. So you've got red root rot, you've got multiple different Fusarium species. You've got probably multiple different Rhizoctonia species. You've got anthracnose, which is fairly prevalent in crown rot infected plants. And so there are 3 or 4 different species of fungi that contribute to crown rot, and then probably numerous different subspecies or races within those species that contribute to crown rot. So if you're trying to develop hybrids that are resistant to crown rot, it's really hard to make something that's resistant to 4 or 5 different things. And if you've got different races involved, then it gets even more difficult. So it's not going to be easy to make hybrids that are quote unquote resistant to crown rot. But we're certainly working on that. We're looking at chemical ways to suppress crown rot. We're looking at different management practices that would help. And I guess I'll just tease a little bit that when Cal and I are able to be on here in either 2 weeks or 4 weeks, we'll dig a little deeper into that crown rot conversation. But I've joked with some people that tar spot got all the attention this year, and everybody's talking about tar spot. I would argue that in many cases, at least in my territory, crown rot was equally important, and in some cases more important than tar spot was this year. But if I educate people about that, it almost gets to be a harder conversation because when I tell you that crown rot was maybe a bigger deal than tar spot, you go, okay, how do I control crown rot? And I'm thinking, well, can we talk about tar spot again? Because it's actually easier to control than crown rot is. So crown rot is a big deal. It's very much a soil influenced disease, and it is very much an environmentally influenced disease. And if you're planting early on heavy, black, flat ground that tends to be wet anyway, and then you get the right weather conditions, crown rot is going to be a potential, thing that you're going to battle, year in and year out. It's also always made worse by late season stress. So the interaction between tar spot and crown rot this year was tar spot in many cases, or southern rust, or both, provided the late season stress by killing half the leaves that the crown rot really took advantage of. Drought stress also contributes to that. So if you've got a plant that's infected with crown rot and going through a stressful grain fill period, watch out. If you've got a plant that's infected with crown rot, which I would argue virtually every plant is every year, but you don't have a stressful grain fill period, then the crown rot may not hurt you too bad. It's still going to be there, but it may not take the plant out at the knees. So anything we can do to suppress the crown rot infection early and then alleviate stress on the plant during grain fill is how we're going to short-term manage crown rot, and trying to develop those hybrids that are more resistant. That will be an ongoing effort. Anything else on that topic, Adam, before we maybe go into rootworm?
I don't think so, Lance. I think you covered it well, and like you said, and be sure to tune in for one of the episodes we're going to have here pretty soon. Get Chris Callow. He's got some more specific information he's going to try and share with Lance and us with the Ask the Agronomist episode. So be on the lookout for that.
Yep, and I would put a plug in if you've got the ability on your farm to do some strip trials. Maybe you've got a planter that's got liquid in-furrow capabilities. Maybe you're using products to try to suppress crown rot at planting time. If you're really interested in that and want to do some trials, reach out to Cal or I or your FSR, and we might be able to do some work with you on your own farm to try to understand that better, because I do think that there is a lot of potential for more work to be done around crown rot. And it is one of those diseases that's very frustrating because, and tar spot's a little bit this way too, but with crown rot, almost everything you do to make your corn better increases your odds of, crown rot being an issue. If we'd quit trying to raise 300 bushel corn, crown rot probably would be less of an issue. But the thicker we plant, the earlier we plant, the higher we drive populations, the higher we drive our fertility. We're just setting that plant up to be under more stress during grain fill. And that, I think, I don't necessarily think we've ended up with genetics that are more susceptible to crown rot than what we've had in the past. We are just doing a better job creating the environment that crown rot becomes a problem than we used to in the past. So let's touch on rootworm a little bit. So we've had the luxury here in Central Illinois of not living in the rootworm hotspot in recent years. If you go back 10 years or so ago, Central Illinois was kind of a rootworm hotspot, not so much the far western part of the state, but from say the Illinois River east in Central Illinois. 10 years ago, we were fighting rootworm, heavy rootworm pressure on virtually every acre. And then a couple things happened. We had a very, very wet May, June in 2015 that drowned a lot of larvae. And at about the same time, we switched to SmartStax technology being broadly adopted, and other improved rootworm products being used on more acres. A lot more pyramided or stacked trait rootworm products being used, went away from the single mode of action rootworm products. And so at the same time that Mother Nature gave us a helping hand by decimating the rootworm population with a really wet spring, we switched to products that were better. And then on top of that, we primarily went back to rotation in Central Illinois. We had been on our continuous corn kick for a few years there when corn prices were high, and a lot of people were doing a lot more corn on corn and continuous corn. As you look at parts of the country that maybe didn't go through that same change, so you get up in northern Illinois where there's been fields that haven't seen a soybean in 20 plus years. They've stayed with a lot more corn, a lot more continuous corn. Rootworm's really never gone away in northern Illinois. It's just been getting worse. And every year we do field surveys with yellow sticky traps where we're monitoring the adult beetle population. And we've been able to track from 19 to 20 an increase in the population of rootworm beetles, and then from 20 to 21, a pretty significant increase in population of rootworm beetles, primarily centered around regions of the country where there's been a lot more history of corn production. So northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, and Nebraska. When you get into areas where there's been a lot of continuous corn, that's where we see the heaviest pressure. And, that's, partly the biology of the insect. It's a little bit hard to say how much resistance is playing into that, but we know that is a factor. When you've got, low dose technologies, which all the rootworm traits have always been a low dose technology, you do not get 100% control of the pest. And so if you've got really, really, really heavy pressure and you need 99% control to have a good outcome, those products were really never designed to give you 99% control of that pest. So we have to manage that population in addition to, utilizing those products. So, we've seen a trend where rootworm populations have been increasing. For us here in West Central Illinois and Greater Central Illinois, we still have not yet seen a dramatic increase in populations of rootworm beetles in soybean fields. So there are a couple exceptions to that. If you're in a local geography where there's a lot of corn on corn, and you've got the only field of first year corn that's, other people's corn on corn or continuous corn, you could have a hot spot in that field where you've got a little heavier pressure than you would normally expect to see on first year corn. The other way you can create your own first year corn rootworm problem is with really bad volunteer corn in soybeans. And we've had some of that the last couple of years. Unfortunately, we'll have a lot of volunteer corn in some soybean fields next year with all the down corn that people had this fall and delayed harvest and such. And if you've got volunteer corn that goes unchecked in a soybean field, to the rootworm beetle, that field starts to look a lot like a cornfield. And any rootworm, so if you think about it, rootworms lay their eggs typically in corn. If it's not a variant, they're laying eggs in corn. You rotate that field to soybeans the next year, there's no corn out there. So those rootworms that hatch out in your soybean field next year, even if they're a variant, so even the variant of the Western corn rootworm that prefers to lay eggs in soybean fields cannot survive as a larvae in a soybean field. Rootworm cannot survive on feeding on soybean roots. They need grass roots to feed on. So they can live on foxtail, they can live on fall panicum, they can live on volunteer corn. So if you've got a soybean field that's full of volunteer corn, basically what you're doing is feeding the rootworm population that got laid in that field the previous year when it was corn. And if those rootworms survive in that soybean field, they hatch in that soybean field, they're probably going to lay eggs in that soybean field just because, again, they think they're in a cornfield because there's so much volunteer corn out there. So that's not really a variant situation. That's just a regular old rootworm living on volunteer corn that happens to be in your soybean field. So in addition to, just having a clean field, another reason to control volunteer corn is to make sure that you don't create a first year corn rootworm scenario. So those are the two scenarios in Central Illinois, West Central Illinois, where I get a little bit concerned about rootworm pressure potentially on first year corn. But I put on my new SmartStax Pro shirt this morning because I want to talk a little bit about Pro, and I'll give a shout out to Nick Weber, a colleague of ours that works in our knowledge transfer group. And apparently I wear black polos a lot on Ask the Agronomist, and Nick kind of called me out on that. And so today I'm wearing a slate gray polo with a different product logo on it than what I typically wear. So and it's appropriate because we want to talk about SmartStax Pro anyway. So if you haven't heard about SmartStax Pro, that will be the next generation of rootworm resistant technology that's going to come out in the marketplace in 22. Technology was actually approved a year earlier than we were expecting it to. It's been a long time since we've got a trait approved early. We actually got full trade approval for it before we were ready to sell it, which is a little uncommon these days. But we will have introductory quantities of SmartStax Pro in the marketplace in 22. I'm going to learn more about that on a call actually tomorrow. The products that we're actually going to have and how we're going to get those out there. But I would argue that a lot of times companies bring products out, and sometimes as a customer, you're looking at that product going, well, do I really need that product? Is that a new product that I really want and I see a lot of need for? Or is it just a new product because that's what you guys do? You bring out new stuff and then you try to convince me that I need it. If you're farming in northern Illinois, southern Minnesota, southern Wisconsin, parts of Nebraska, northeast, central Iowa, you don't need any convincing to know that you need some better technology to control rootworms. We've got guys in northern Illinois that are using rootworm resistant corn and a full rate of soil insecticide on top of it, and still not satisfied with the level of protection that they're getting. And so we definitely need some better technology in the marketplace. Genuity SmartStax is absolutely the best product on the market today, but we need something better, and SmartStax Pro will be that something better. What SmartStax Pro is the same proteins that are in SmartStax today, with the addition of a new technology that is RNAi based, so it's non-BT, that will be the first non-BT genetic control mechanism for rootworm. So we've been relying on BT to control corn rootworm for over 20 years. And it's past time for something new. And we've seen, in field trials over the past 3 or 4 years with SmartStax Pro, that if you're in areas where rootworm are really, really heavy populations, really, really hard to control, probably a fair amount of BT resistance in those populations, we're seeing dramatically improved control with SmartStax Pro. I would say in those environments, SmartStax Pro is better than technology that's available today with a full rate of soil insecticide, on top of it. Now, that being said, you cannot use one thing year in, year out, year after year after year after year, forever, and control corn rootworm without breaking the system. Corn rootworm have a history, even worse than Waterhemp, of getting around things. They've adapted around rotation. They've adapted or become resistant to soil applied insecticides. They've adapted or become resistant to BT. They will adapt and become resistant to every method we use to control them. And what we're trying to do is stay one step ahead of them. So in addition to, looking at things like, SmartStax Pro, we're going to be talking to growers about in what situations do we need to do adult beetle control. If you're applying a fungicide in corn, we've talked a lot about that. We're maybe changing some timings on fungicide applications in corn. We're maybe making multiple fungicide applications in corn. And so we've got more and better opportunities to do adult beetle control in corn. And so that's something that you need to look at. And first and foremost is crop rotation. I know in certain parts of the country, soybeans are a dirty word. Guys have had bad experiences with soybeans. They remember raising 45 and 50 bushel beans, and they remember raising 300 bushel corn. And if you're considering 50 bushel beans versus 300 bushel corn, that's a pretty easy decision. You grow more corn. I've been in fields myself in northern Illinois that have so many rocks and stones in them. I would not want to have my platform out in that field harvesting soybeans either. There are areas where we need corn on every acre for livestock reasons, for silage and for corn stalk bales and feed corn. And so I get it. There's places that soybeans just maybe don't fit as a crop, maybe on some really highly erodible ground. Maybe you can't meet your conservation plan with the amount of residue that soybeans produce. But I will say this, from a rootworm management standpoint, if you can figure out a way to get a year of soybeans on a farm that's been in corn for 5+ years, do it. There are huge benefits to managing that rootworm population, and you can really reset that clock. So if you're battling rootworm in a field of continuous corn, my first recommendation before you start looking at new traits, before you start looking at insecticide, before you start looking at adult beetle control, let's consider planting soybeans in that field. If you can do that, that's the place to start. Reset the clock, reset that population, and then we can start with SmartStax Pro and maybe some adult beetle control. We also think there's potential with Pro to help reduce the population of adult beetles, because insecticides do not do anything to reduce rootworm beetle populations. So you can use a full rate of whatever good soil applied rootworm insecticide you want. The rootworm are going to feed outside of the area of treatment. They're going to thrive outside the area of treatment, and there's going to be just as many adults emerge from that insecticide treated field than there would be from an uninsecticide treated field. The old traits that we've been working with don't do a great job. As I said, they're low dose technology. They prevent the rootworm from feeding as much as they want to, but they don't kill all of them. In some cases, they don't kill very many of them at all. They just prevent them from feeding enough that you get close to full yield potential and you get good protection of that root system. But eventually that insect survives. Eventually that larvae develops into an adult, and eventually they emerge out of the soil. With the RNAi technology that's part of SmartStax Pro, we see a higher level of larval control, and that will lead to fewer adults emerging. So I don't know that we're going to eliminate the need for adult beetle control with SmartStax Pro, but we will reduce the number of adult beetles that emerge from the soil with that technology. And the last thing I would say is you'll probably hear from some of our competition that all rootworm traits need help. We just need to go back to using soil applied insecticides. Traits replaced soil applied insecticides over 20 years ago for rootworm control in corn, because the soil applied insecticide was not effective enough. They were more expensive. They were less consistent. They were less safe. There were just lots of reasons why you pretty quickly adopted traits and quit using insecticides. Insecticides haven't gotten any better in the last 20 or 25 years that you haven't been using them. And there are situations where you can get a better root rating if you pair an insecticide up with a trait. You may improve your standability if you pair an insecticide up with your trait. Occasionally, you can get a yield increase pairing an insecticide up with a trait. But the reality is that insecticide, if it works, if it's not too dry or too wet, here's your root system, here's your soil surface, you're going to have a zone of protection from that soil applied insecticide that's here. The trait is protecting here. So even if you do a really good job protecting your roots here, which these are the roots that drive your root rating. So root ratings don't do a great job of telling you how much feeding went on down here, because we can only look here when we do a root rating. You can't dig up all this and rate that. You can dig up this and rate that. So root ratings on insecticides oftentimes will be better, but if you're in a dry weather situation or a stressful situation, and that plant's trying to live on this root system, but this root system's all gone, that's not going to end well. This root system can hold the plant up. This is the root system that's primarily responsible for supporting the plant. These roots down here are the ones that are primarily responsible for feeding the plant, which is what's driving the yield. So that's why we can get similar root ratings in some cases with insecticides when they perform well versus traits, but you will not get the same yield typically with a soil applied insecticide that you can with the trait when the trait is functioning at its best. Now, it is fair to say that the traits on today, are not functioning at their best in some of these really high population situations where we've probably got levels of resistance building. And that's where we really need SmartStax Pro technology to help get some new products out in the marketplace, get some new technology in the marketplace that the rootworm has not had time to adapt to, that has a very high level of control. What we don't want to do is just put a new trait out there and keep doing everything else the same we've always done, because we can break that technology as well. We've got new products in development, corn rootworm 4, corn rootworm 5, which will be our 4th and 5th generation rootworm technology. So we're not resting on our laurels, so to speak. We're still developing new traits, new products, because we know we're going to need them in the future as rootworm adapts. But look for an opportunity to try some SmartStax Pro next year. And I would say in central Illinois on rotated ground, you're not really going to see a benefit to the technology until we've got heavier rootworm pressure than we've got today. So we're probably going to be looking at those corn on corn and continuous corn acres in central Illinois to do some trial work with SmartStax Pro next year. And I know my colleagues in northern Illinois and other parts of the country are really, really anxious to get SmartStax Pro out there and start to win the battle against corn rootworm, because the last couple of years it's kind of felt like the rootworm has been winning, and they really want to turn the tables. So any questions come in, Adam, or anything you've got?
No questions. I was just going to say, back to your number one recommendation, if you're fighting rootworm with the rotation, not always, but oftentimes if you rotate soybeans, there's a pretty good soybean yield that follows those continuous years of corn.
Yep. So, that's one of the challenges of, I like soybeans as a crop. The reality is the less of them you grow, the better they will be. So if you're growing soybeans in a 50-50 rotation and achieving 80 plus bushel beans, you're a hell of a soybean grower. If you throw beans into a field once every 20 years and they make 95 bushel, that doesn't impress me as much as 82 on 50-50 rotated acres. I've always argued that for soybean yield contests, there need to be a separate category for soybeans that are getting planted in long-term continuous cornfields, because that's cheating when it comes to soybean yields. So if you're winning yield contests in soybeans because you're planting soybeans once every 20 years, I want to create a separate category for that. And those of us that are raising soybeans on 50-50 rotation, we need it's kind of like, bowling with,
the bumpers.
With the bumpers, we need our own category, so it's fair. So anyway, with that, I think we're probably past time. So
next one's on December 2nd.
Yeah, so December 2nd we'll have another episode, and we'll have one more after that prior to Christmas, and that'll probably be the last episode of Ask the Agronomist for the year. And I do want to put out a little bit of a teaser. We are trying to come up with some sort of just thank you to those of you who have participated in Ask the Agronomist to maybe enter into some kind of raffle. So be looking for information on that. I don't know how we're going to do that yet, but I do know that you will have to be logged in live to the last episode of the year to be eligible to win that raffle. And look for more details coming on that. But really appreciate those of you that log in live. I know it doesn't work for everybody. I know a lot of people like to watch it after the fact when it's recorded. You can go back and watch every old episode of Ask the Agronomist. They're all out there. But Adam and I and Jennifer, when she's here, we love the interaction with the live audience. And I've always had a dream for Ask the Agronomist of having 50 or 100 people chatting in questions, while we're live here talking. And that way I don't have to prepare anything. We just talk about what you want to talk about. And I think that's how Ask the Agronomist works the best. And so we're gonna do something to have a little bit of fun with those of us who join in the live chat audience on the last episode. That'll be coming up in 4 weeks. So our next episode will be 2 weeks from today, which I think December 2nd. Is that right, Adam?
That's right. Yep.
So December 2nd will be our next episode. I hope you all get done with harvest before the next episode. I hope I get done with harvest before the next episode. Everybody stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.